William Bill Harris, an 82-year-old African-American veteran, reached for the door of the Sunny Haven dinner. His hands, weathered and strong, bore the marks of a lifetime of service and resilience. All Samuel wanted was a peaceful Sunday breakfast, a simple pleasure for a man who had sacrificed so much for his country. But in the small town of Willow Creek, where prejudice simmered quietly beneath the surface of Southern charm, even a plate of scrambled eggs could spark a confrontation. As William eased into a corner booth, he had no way of knowing that his tranquil morning was about to take a dramatic turn. Across the room, Dan, the diner's owner, watched him with an icy stare. Dan's face, once warm as he greeted other customers, now twisted into a mask of disdain. What William saw as a quiet morning ritual, Dan saw as an unwelcome presence. Unbeknownst to either man, a group of tough-looking patrons sat in a shadowed corner. They were silent but watchful, their leather jackets adorned with patches and their expressions unreadable. These quiet observers would soon play a role neither William nor Dan could have predicted, a role that would alter the course of events in Willow Creek forever. The small town of Willow Creek awoke to a serene Sunday morning. Its picturesque streets, framed by quaint storefronts and blooming flower beds, painted an image of timeless tranquility. But like many American towns, this idyllic veneer concealed deep-seated tensions. Beneath the friendly waves and neighborly smiles lay unspoken divides that had lingered for generations. These hidden rifts were about to surface in an unexpected and explosive way. On the outskirts of town, in a modest house worn by time but filled with memories, William began his day. The first rays of sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, rousing him gently from his sleep. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to navigate life's hardships with grace. His joints creaked in protest as he rose, a reminder of years of service and the passage of time. William's face, lined with wrinkles that told stories of laughter and pain, reflected the life he had lived. His dark eyes, though dimmed slightly with age, still carried a spark of the determination that had defined his youth. They were the eyes of a man who had faced countless challenges and emerged stronger each time. In the quiet of the morning, William followed his daily routine. He splashed cold water on his face, savoring the invigorating chill that chased away the last remnants of sleep. As he gazed into the mirror, the reflection staring back at him carried echoes of his past. For a fleeting moment, the face in the mirror shifted. William saw himself as a young soldier, his back straight, his eyes clear, and his heart filled with the idealism of a man ready to serve his country. The vision lasted only a moment before reality reasserted itself. Decades had passed since those days. William had fought with honor, believing that his sacrifices would contribute to a brighter future. Yet, even now, he found himself wrestling with the same prejudices he had hoped to help eradicate through his service. He sighed, pushing aside the heavy thoughts that threatened to weigh him down. Today was a new day, and William had no intention of letting bitter memories steal his peace. He chose his clothes with care, reaching for a crisp button-down shirt and a pair of neatly pressed slacks. But it was the jacket he handled most reverently, a military coat adorned with medals, a tangible reminder of his service, his sacrifices, and his enduring pride. As William slipped on the jacket, the weight of the medals rested heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just the physical weight, it was the memories they carried. Moments of fear, triumph, and loss all converged in those small, gleaming emblems. With his military cap placed firmly on his head, William squared his shoulders and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Today, his regular breakfast spot was closed for renovations, a small disruption to his usual routine. He had heard good things about the Sunny Haven Diner, a cozy eatery famous for its hearty breakfasts and warm atmosphere. The thought of fluffy scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and freshly brewed coffee made his mouth water. William smiled to himself as he walked through the quiet streets, greeting passers-by with polite nods. Some returned his greetings warmly, while others barely acknowledged him. He had long since learned to take such reactions in stride, though each slight was a small, lingering ache. When William finally reached the Sunny Haven Diner, its quaint exterior and cheerful sign promised a welcoming experience. As he pushed open the door, a soft chime announced his arrival. The aroma of sizzling bacon and rich coffee greeted him, enveloping him in a comforting warmth. William paused to take in the scene. Families chatted over breakfast, couples lingered over steaming mugs of coffee, and solo diners flipped through newspapers. In the corner, the rough-looking group of bikers laughed quietly among themselves, their presence adding an unexpected texture to the otherwise idyllic scene. He felt a small flutter of nerves, a natural reaction to stepping into unfamiliar territory. But William reminded himself that he had faced far greater challenges. With a steadying breath, he made his way to an empty booth and settled in, ready to enjoy a peaceful breakfast. What he didn't know was that his presence in the Sunny Haven diner that morning would set into motion a series of events that would challenge the very heart of Willow Creek, and Samuel himself. William Bill Harris adjusted the lapel of his jacket, the most meaningful piece of his wardrobe. This wasn't just any jacket, it bore the military medals he had earned over decades of service. Each ribbon and clasp represented a moment etched deeply into his memory. Battles fought, brothers lost, moments of fear and triumph. As Bill slipped the jacket on, he felt its weight, a reminder of both his service and the sacrifices that had shaped his life. He reached for his military cap, his movements deliberate. Placing it on his head, he adjusted it until it sat perfectly, just as it had all those years ago when he first donned his uniform as a young recruit. In his mind's eye, he saw the eager young man he once was, standing tall in front of a mirror, filled with pride and purpose. That pride still lingered, tempered now by age, experience, and the knowledge that the world didn't always meet his hopes for fairness and change. Taking a deep breath, Bill straightened his shoulders. Today, he was ready to embrace a small change in his routine. His regular breakfast spot, a modest café where the staff greeted him by name, was closed for renovations. Instead of lamenting the inconvenience, Bill decided to try a new place, something he rarely did. He had heard whispers about a spot called the Sunny Haven Diner. Locals praised its home-style cooking, cozy atmosphere, and a signature breakfast of fluffy scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and golden hash browns. The thought of that hearty meal, coupled with a steaming cup of freshly brewed coffee, made his mouth water. It seemed like the perfect morning to broaden his horizons. As Bill made his way down Willow Creek's quiet streets, the crisp morning air carried a sense of possibility. He greeted passers-by with polite nods. Some returned his gesture warmly, offering a smile or a friendly good morning. Others avoided his gaze entirely, their reactions ranging from indifference to discomfort. Bill had grown accustomed to this dichotomy over the years. Still, each slight, however small, left a sting. It was a subtle but constant reminder of the unspoken divisions that still lingered despite his years of service to the country. At last, he arrived at the Sunny Haven. Its exterior was welcoming, with large windows revealing a glimpse of a warm interior filled with the gentle hum of conversation. A hand-painted sign above the door swung softly in the breeze, its cheerful message reading, "The Sunny Haven, where everyone belongs." Bill smiled at the sentiment, hoping it would prove to be true. He pushed open the door, and a small bell above the frame chimed, announcing his arrival. Immediately, the aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. The diner's interior was every bit as inviting as its exterior. Soft yellow lights cast a gentle glow over polished wooden tables and cushioned booths. The morning crowd was moderate but lively, families laughing over pancakes, couples sharing quiet conversations, and a few solo diners absorbed in books or newspapers. Bill noticed a group of bikers sitting in a corner booth. Their leather jackets were adorned with patches, and their rugged appearances added a surprising element to the otherwise quaint scene. Despite their tough exterior, their camaraderie was evident in their laughter and animated gestures. As Bill scanned the room, a flutter of nervousness crept into his stomach. He reminded himself that stepping into unfamiliar territory was nothing compared to the challenges he had faced throughout his life. With a steadying breath, he moved towards an empty booth by the window. Sliding into the cushioned seat, Bill took in his surroundings once more. The gentle clinking of coffee cups, the hum of friendly chatter, and the inviting smells from the kitchen all combined to create a sense of comfort. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, looking forward to enjoying his breakfast in this new place. But sometimes, comfort can be fleeting. What Bill didn't know was that this quiet morning in the sunny haven would soon lead to an encounter that would test his patience, his dignity, and his belief in the possibility of change. As William Bill Harris stepped fully into the Sunny Haven diner, he took a moment to survey his surroundings. Near the back, a group of men sat wearing worn leather jackets decorated with patches, a few of them sporting impressive beards. They laughed loudly at intervals as stacker their voices, creating a playful contrast to the hum of quiet conversations around the room. Bill felt a flutter of nerves, the kind that often surfaced when stepping into new territory. But he quickly reminded himself of the countless daunting situations he had faced in his lifetime, each one testing his patience and resolve in ways far more intense than this. With a steadying breath, he moved with the measured, observant pace of a man who knew to navigate each new environment carefully. Years of military service had trained Bill to scan his surroundings instinctively. His eyes moved over the room, noting the well-worn yet polished wooden floor, the mismatched chairs that lent the diner a certain charm, and the walls adorned with local artwork, a window into the community spirit of Willow Creek. Just then, a young waitress approached him, her name tag identifying her as Lily. She greeted Bill with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that brought to mind his granddaughter's smile. That small resemblance stirred a rush of emotions in him, a mix of love for his family and a quiet sadness at the miles that so often kept them apart. "Good morning, sir," Lily said cheerfully. "Welcome to the Sunny Haven. Would you like a table or a spot at the counter?" Her friendliness seemed to melt some of the tension Bill hadn't even realized he'd been holding. He found himself smiling back, her warmth making him feel just a bit more at ease. "Good morning," he replied, his voice rich with the depth and calm of his years. "A booth would be nice if you have one open." Lily nodded, gesturing toward a cozy booth by the window. "Right this way, sir. You'll have a great view of the town waking up while you enjoy your breakfast." Bill followed her to the booth, settling into the vinyl seat with his usual straight posture, a habit ingrained from his days in uniform. The seat creaked slightly under his weight, a comforting sound that added to the diner's welcoming atmosphere. Once he was seated, Lily handed him a menu, its laminated pages showing the wear and tear of frequent use, a sign, Bill thought, of a well-loved establishment. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" she asked, her pen poised and ready. "That would be wonderful, thank you," Bill replied gratefully. As Lily went to fetch his coffee, he let his gaze wander around the diner once more, observing the people around him. He saw families sharing laughter over breakfast, the sound of children's giggles breaking through the gentle murmur of the other patrons. A few solo diners occupied seats at the counter, sipping coffee and reading newspapers. And in the corner, the group of bikers continued their animated discussion, their rugged appearance adding an unexpected contrast to the cozy setting. Bill felt a blend of caution and curiosity as he observed the various faces. He had lived long enough to know that appearances could be misleading, and that a friendly smile didn't always signify a welcoming heart. However, he'd also experienced enough of life's surprises to know that kindness could emerge from the most unexpected sources. As Lily returned, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, Bill nodded in thanks and took a slow sip, savoring the rich, warming flavor. The atmosphere around him began to settle into a comfortable hum, and he felt himself relaxing, allowing the promise of a simple breakfast to ease the day's early anxieties. Bill looked out the window, the small town coming to life before him, and took another sip of coffee. Here in the Sunny Haven, he had hoped to find a moment of peace and belonging. But as he would soon discover, sometimes the simplest hopes are the hardest to secure. Bill Harris scanned the menu, the comforting aromas of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon surrounding him and stirring his appetite. Although the menu offered an impressive variety of hearty dishes, his attention settled on the diner's special, scrambled eggs with crispy bacon and a side of golden hash browns. It sounded just right, and he looked forward to savoring the simple, satisfying meal. Lily returned to his table, setting down a steaming mug of coffee. The rich aroma filled Bill with a sense of warmth and reassurance. "Here you go, sir," she said with a smile. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes?" Bill was about to respond when a commotion from the kitchen caught his attention. The swinging door flew open, and a man with a bald head that gleamed under the diner lights strode into the room. He looked to be in his late 40s. And Bill assumed he must be the owner. At first, the man's expression was welcoming as he glanced around at his customers, nodding to the familiar faces of regulars. But as his gaze landed on Bill, something in his demeanor changed. The warmth in his expression faded, his smile faltered and was replaced by a frown. Bill felt a familiar, sinking feeling. He recognized that look all too well, a look that, without words, communicated, "You don't belong here." For a brief moment, Bill considered leaving, avoiding the confrontation he sensed was brewing. Yet, after a lifetime of holding his ground, of asserting his right to occupy spaces where others might say he didn't belong, he felt rooted to his seat. He wasn't about to let anyone dictate where he could or couldn't enjoy his breakfast. Turning back to Lily, who seemed blissfully unaware of the tension, Bill managed a steady voice. "I'll have the special," he said, "and maybe a side of toast, if that's all right." Lily's face lit up. "Excellent choice. Our scrambled eggs are what people come here for. I'll put that in for you right away." She noted his order with a friendly smile before walking away, leaving Bill to sip his coffee. As he savored the warm, rich taste, he tried to focus on the comfort of his surroundings. The cozy booth, the delicious scents in the air, and the quiet promise of a hearty breakfast. But a feeling of unease settled in his chest, one he couldn't entirely shake. Meanwhile, the owner had disappeared back into the kitchen, but muffled voices soon reached Bill's ears, their tone urgent and agitated. It sounded like a tense conversation was unfolding behind the kitchen doors. Bill braced himself, knowing from experience that the calm before a storm was often the hardest to endure. Sure enough, after a few moments, the kitchen door swung open again. The owner emerged, his face set in a determined expression, and made a direct path toward Bill's table. Each step he took seemed to heighten the tension in the room. Bill took a deep breath, his shoulders squared, and posture resolute. He had faced the brutality of war, withstood the countless trials of military life, and persevered through years of facing discrimination. Whatever this man had in mind, Bill was ready to meet it, with the quiet dignity that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. As the owner approached, Bill looked up, meeting the man's gaze head-on. In the owner's eyes, he saw a flicker of anger, tightly held in check, but undeniably there. Bill held his ground, preparing himself for what was to come. As the owner approached, Bill Harris noticed the subtle fear beneath his hardened expression, a look Bill had seen countless times before. It was the look of someone uncomfortable with their own prejudice, feeling threatened simply by the presence of someone different. Bill's hand tightened around his coffee mug, letting its warmth anchor him to the moment. He waited, outwardly calm, for whatever was coming next. The man's name tag read Dan, and as he reached Bill's table, his tense body language spoke volumes. His friendly demeanor had vanished, replaced by a cold hostility that made Bill's heart sink. Dan's voice was rough, each word forced as if costing him great effort. "We're full up today. You'll have to leave." His tone tried to sound authoritative, but a slight tremor betrayed the nervousness underlying his words. Bill blinked, surprised by the obvious lie. He glanced around the diner, seeing several empty tables and vacant seats at the counter. The confusion on his face seemed to harden Dan's expression further. "Excuse me," Bill began, his voice calm and even. "There appear to be plenty of open seats. Is there an issue?" He met Dan's gaze with steady composure, his years of experience in such situations allowing him to remain outwardly unruffled, even as a familiar wariness settled into his bones. Dan's face hardened further, his prejudice overriding any sense of professionalism or basic decency. His voice grew louder as he repeated, "I said we're full. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The words echoed through the diner, capturing the attention of nearby patrons, who began turning to watch the exchange. A heavy weight settled in Bill's chest. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that his country, the one he had fought for, had moved beyond such blatant discrimination. Yet here he was, decades after his service, facing the same ugliness he'd hoped would have faded with time. Slowly and with quiet dignity, Bill stood up. His movements were controlled, each gesture deliberate as he steadied himself against the table. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of containing the complex surge of emotions rushing through him: humiliation, frustration, and a deep sense of disappointment. "Sir," Bill said in a low but firm voice that carried easily through the now silent diner, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to enjoy my breakfast, like everyone else." His voice held the patience of a man who had faced this situation too many times before. Beneath that patience, though, was a deep sadness, a realization that some things hadn't changed as much as he had once hoped. Dan's response was immediate and cutting. "Your kind isn't welcome here. This is a respectable establishment," he spat, his words hanging in the air, stark in their blatant racism. A collective gasp spread across the diner as the full weight of Dan's words registered with the other patrons. The growing silence made the ugliness of the moment all the more glaring. Bill felt as though he'd been struck, the sting of rejection painfully familiar, yet no less hurtful. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him now, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few seeming to agree silently with Dan's sentiments. Bill felt as though Dan's words had landed a physical blow. The casual cruelty and ease with which Dan dismissed his dignity struck him deeply, a painful reminder of battles he had fought on distant shores and here at home. Bill looked around the diner, taking in the various reactions on the faces of other patrons. Some looked shocked and disgusted at Dan's behavior. Others appeared uncomfortable, their eyes shifting away from the scene. A few, to Bill's dismay, nodded subtly in agreement with Dan's sentiments. The divide in the community became painfully clear in that moment, a reminder of the larger struggles still facing the nation. Bill's gaze found Lily, the young waitress who had welcomed him so warmly. Her face was a mask of horror, her knuckles white as she clutched her notepad. She looked torn, clearly distressed by her boss's behavior but hesitant to risk her job by speaking up. Bill felt a pang of sympathy for her, thinking of his own granddaughter and the world she was growing up in. An oppressive silence filled the diner, each patron holding their breath, waiting to see what Bill would do next. He felt the weight of all those eyes on him, a mixture of expectations, judgments, and unspoken questions. In that instant, standing in a place where he had hoped for nothing more than a simple, peaceful breakfast, Bill felt the full weight of his years. His mind turned to the countless times he had faced similar situations, standing quietly but firmly against prejudice in diners, towns, and even in the military he had served so loyally. He thought of the progress that had been made, the battles won, but also how much further there still was to go. He felt the depth of prejudice rooted in hearts that hadn't evolved with the times. Taking a steadying breath, Bill squared his shoulders. He had two choices. He could leave quietly, sparing himself further confrontation but allowing Dan's bigotry to go unchallenged, or he could stand his ground, asserting his right to be there and demanding the respect owed to any other patron. The soldier in him, the man who had fought for the ideals his country claimed to uphold, knew there was only one choice. Bill's decision was made in an instant, though to him it felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. He wouldn't back down, not here, not now. He had faced worse, and he had always stood tall. This moment would be no exception. With deliberate movements, Bill reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of controlling the anger and pain that threatened to overwhelm him. He withdrew his worn military ID, its edges frayed, but the information still visible and clear. "I've served this country for over 30 years, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of sacrifices and experiences most in the room could never imagine. As Bill spoke, memories flashed through his mind. He saw himself as a young man, standing tall in his uniform, filled with hope and determination. Bill Harris's heart ached as he remembered the years he had given to his country, the friends he had lost, and the sacrifices he had made. He had fought not only for his safety and freedom, but also in the belief that his efforts would bring positive change for generations to come. Yet, here he stood, still fighting for the right to enjoy a simple breakfast in peace. Dan, the owner, momentarily stunned by Bill's revelation, quickly forced his face back into a look of defiance. A flicker of shame crossed his expression, only to be replaced by renewed anger. It was as if Bill's display of pride and dignity only made Dan more defensive, more determined to assert his misguided authority. "I don't care what you did," Dan snapped, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his insecurity. "You're not welcome here. Get out before I call the police." The threat hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder of the power dynamics that could shift so quickly against someone deemed unwelcome. Dan's words cut deeply. Bill had faced the horrors of war, defended his country, and yet here he was, still seen as less than equal, still denied basic respect. For a brief moment he was tempted to argue, to make Dan and everyone else in the diner understand the injustice of the situation. The soldier in him wanted to stand his ground, to fight this battle, as he had fought so many others. But experience had taught him that some minds were entrenched, unwilling to change. With a heavy heart, Bill turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped under the weight of this indignity. He felt the eyes of the patrons on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few even seemingly satisfied with the outcome. Their varied reactions underscored the divided world he still lived in. As Bill walked toward the door, his thoughts spun. He recalled the strides toward equality he had witnessed over the years, the barriers broken, the battles won. But moments like these reminded him of how far there was still to go. He thought of his grandchildren and wondered if they would inherit a world where they, too, would have to fight these same battles. The thought filled him with a deep sadness. Just as he reached for the door handle, ready to step out into the morning sun and leave the painful encounter behind, the silence in the diner was abruptly broken by the scrape of chairs against the floor. The sound was loud and unexpected, jarring in the heavy quiet that had fallen over the room. Bill turned, curiosity momentarily overriding his desire to leave. His hand paused on the door handle as he looked back, unsure of what he would see. The group of bikers who had been sitting quietly in the corner was now on their feet, their expressions resolute. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard, was striding purposefully toward Bill and Dan, his gait commanding attention. Behind him, the other bikers fell into line, forming a united front that drew the gaze of everyone in the diner. Bill felt a rush of emotions, surprise at this unexpected show of solidarity, curiosity about what would unfold next, and a touch of apprehension. He had learned long ago not to make assumptions based on appearances. But he couldn't help but wonder what these men intended to do. Bill's eyes fixed on the biker leader who now stood just a few feet away, assessing the situation with sharp, observant eyes that flicked between Bill and Dan. There was a calm but unmistakable authority in the biker's presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured yet carried a weight that demanded attention. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" he asked, his gaze settling firmly on Dan. Dan, who had been so confident a moment ago in his confrontation with Bill, now looked visibly unsettled. His eyes darted around the diner, seeming to realize for the first time that he had an audience. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead as he tried to regain his composure, but his bravado was slipping. "This is none of your business," Dan said, attempting to keep his voice steady. "It's between me and him." He gestured vaguely in Bill's direction, taking a small step backward. Bill remained where he was, his hand still on the door handle, caught between leaving and staying. He was curious to see how this unexpected intervention would play out. Years of experience had taught him to be cautious, yet something in the biker leader's calm demeanor made him pause. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted. Where there had been tension before, now there was anticipation. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, watching the scene unfold. What had started as a simple act of grabbing breakfast had transformed into something much larger, a moment that felt as if it could change the room's dynamic, tipping in any direction. As Bill stood there, caught between the door and the scene unfolding before him, he found himself reflecting on the unpredictability of life. He had walked into this diner expecting nothing more than a quiet meal. Now he found himself at the center of a confrontation that seemed to represent something far beyond himself, an echo of the larger struggles within society. He watched as the biker leader stood his ground, a calm but commanding presence in the face of Dan's agitation. In that moment, Bill felt a glimmer of hope stir within him. Perhaps there were still surprises left in the world, he thought. Perhaps support could come from unexpected quarters after all. With that thought, Bill let his hand fall from the door handle and turned fully to face the scene, ready to see how this unexpected chapter in his life would play out. The biker leader's unwavering demeanor only seemed to unnerve Dan further. The cafe owner's earlier bravado was now crumbling, replaced by an anxious, defensive energy that everyone in the room could sense. Dan's eyes darted between Bill, the bikers, and the other patrons, as if he were searching for an ally or an escape route. But the biker leader didn't waver. His gaze remained fixed on Dan, his voice calm yet resolute as he spoke again. "We couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his eyes never leaving Dan. "And we have a few things to say about it." Dan's face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. Trying to reassert his authority, he sputtered, "This is my establishment. I have the right to serve who I want." His voice rose, his desperation becoming more apparent. The biker leader nodded slowly, acknowledging Dan's words, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a quiet strength that seemed to draw everyone's attention. The biker leader looked at Dan, acknowledging his words with a nod that conveyed both understanding and a hint of disagreement. "You're right," he said calmly. "This is your establishment, but with rights come responsibilities, and one of those responsibilities is to treat all people with respect and dignity." As he spoke, the biker reached into his leather jacket. Dan flinched, clearly fearing the worst, but the biker only pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted an old military ID card, similar to the one Bill had shown earlier, and held it up for all to see. "You see," the biker continued, his voice taking on a new intensity, "many of us here are veterans too. We've served alongside men and women of all races, creeds, and backgrounds. We've bled together, fought together, and mourned together." A murmur ran through the cafe as the weight of his words sank in. Bill felt a surge of emotion, surprise, gratitude, and a renewed sense of camaraderie he hadn't experienced in years. It was an unexpected reminder of the bonds that still connected him to those who shared his experiences. The biker leader wasn't finished. He gestured to his companions, and one by one, they stepped forward. Some pulled out their own military IDs, others rolled up sleeves to reveal military tattoos. Each of them stood tall, their faces a blend of pride for their service and anger at the injustice they had just witnessed. One of the bikers, an older black man with graying hair at his temples, stepped up beside the leader, his eyes blazing with controlled anger as he faced Dan. "We fought alongside men of all colors," he stated firmly, his voice cutting through the silence in the diner. "Your prejudice has no place here. It has no place anywhere." Realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, Dan's face contorted with a mixture of fear and resentment. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support from other patrons, but he found only averted gazes and disapproving looks. "This is my cafe," Dan shouted, his voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "I have the right to serve who I want." His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, and he was almost spitting in his agitation. The biker leader remained calm in the face of Dan's outburst. "And we have the right to take our business elsewhere," he replied evenly. "But first, you owe this man an apology." He gestured toward Bill, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. But Dan, pushed beyond reason, was beyond appeasement. He yelled, his face flushed with rage. "Get out, all of you. This is my place and I decide who stays." The biker leader, who had introduced himself as Mark, fixed Dan with a steady gaze. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low but carrying a note of certainty. There was no threat of violence in his words, only the assurance of consequences to come. Throughout the exchange, Bill had been silent, feeling a storm of emotions within him. He was deeply touched by the bikers' support and astonished at the turn of events, but also concerned about how quickly the situation was escalating. While he appreciated their solidarity, he worried about what this would mean for all of them in a town that had long kept prejudice simmering under the surface. Bill was deeply moved by the bikers' unexpected support. but he couldn't shake the concern that the situation might escalate beyond words. Sensing Bill's unease, Mark, the biker leader, turned to him with a reassuring nod. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "We have our own ways of handling things." The other bikers nodded in agreement, a clear purpose in their expressions. With that, Mark gestured to his group, and one by one, they began to file out of the diner. As each biker passed by Bill, they nodded respectfully or murmured a word of support, and Bill felt a lump forming in his throat, overwhelmed by this show of solidarity from men who had been strangers only moments before. Once the last biker had exited, the diner erupted into a murmur of conversation. Some patrons began to leave, relieved by what had just transpired, while others engaged in intense discussions, their voices revealing the emotions stirred up by the morning's events. Dan, his face still flushed with anger, disappeared into the kitchen without a word. Lily, the young waitress, approached Bill hesitantly, her expression full of regret. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your breakfast is on the house if you still want it." Bill looked at her kind face, then at the scene around him. Despite his earlier hunger, he now found he had no appetite left. "Thank you, but I think I'll be going," he replied gently. "It's been quite a morning." Stepping out into the bright morning sunlight, Bill felt a sense of relief, as though he could finally breathe freely again after the tension inside the diner. The group of bikers was waiting outside, and the contrast between the stifling atmosphere inside and the open air outside was sharp and refreshing. Mark walked up to Bill, his face creased with concern. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. Bill nodded, still processing the events that had just unfolded. "I'm all right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to thank you all. You didn't have to do that." The bikers gathered around him, forming a loose but protective circle. Their leather jackets gleamed in the sunlight, patches and pins displaying stories of their own journeys and battles. Bill looked around, realizing that men he might have once been wary of had now become unexpected allies. Mark placed a steady hand on Bill's shoulder, a gesture both comforting and respectful. "We stand up for our own," he said firmly. "No veteran should be treated like you were in there. It goes against everything we fought for." Bill felt his throat tighten as tears threatened to surface. For so long, he'd felt like he was fighting these battles alone, and now, out of nowhere, here was a group of people willing to stand by his side. "I appreciate this more than you know," Bill said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. After a pause, he added, "But I have to ask, what did you mean when you told Dan he'd regret this? I don't want any trouble. I've seen enough of that in my lifetime." Mark's expression softened, understanding in his eyes. "Don't worry," he reassured Bill with a gentle smile. "We have our ways of settling things, and don't worry, no violence." Mark's promise to Bill was steady and reassuring. "Trust me," he said. "We're past those days. We can make our presence felt without a single fist raised." The other bikers nodded in agreement, their faces set with purpose, each of them seeming to share the same determination and sense of justice. Bill looked from face to face, seeing that these men, like him, had likely faced their own battles with prejudice and judgment. They, too, knew what it was like to be seen as less based on appearances alone. Unable to contain his curiosity, Bill asked, "What exactly do you have in mind?" Mark's eyes glinted with a hint of mischief. "Let's just say that Dan's about to learn that actions have consequences, and those consequences can hit where it matters most: his business." Bill felt a wave of emotions wash over him. He was grateful, deeply touched by the bikers' solidarity, but he also felt a slight worry. He didn't want to cause any more division in the town he'd called home for so long. "I appreciate what you're doing," Bill said carefully, "but I don't want to make things worse. Willow Creek has its issues, but it's still home." Mark nodded, understanding. "We're not looking for trouble, Bill. We're looking to set things right. Sometimes that means stirring things up a bit, but we know what we're doing. Trust me." As they spoke, Bill marveled at the way his morning had transformed. He had walked into that diner feeling alone, and now he was surrounded by people willing to stand up for his dignity and rights. It was a powerful reminder that support could sometimes come from the most unlikely of places. "Thank you," Bill said, his voice full of sincerity as he looked at each of the bikers in turn. Truly, it means more than you know. The bikers responded with nods, murmurs of encouragement, and words of support. A sense of solidarity settled over them all, a shared understanding of battles fought on foreign soil and here at home. As the group began to disperse, Mark turned to Bill one last time. "We'll be around," he said. "If you need anything, just let us know, and don't worry about Dan or the diner. We'll make sure justice is served in our own way." With that, the bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life in a symphony of power and unity. Bill watched as they rode off, their leather jackets and gleaming chrome catching the morning sunlight, a striking symbol of resilience and camaraderie. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Bill found himself standing alone on the sidewalk, his mind still spinning from the morning's events. He began his walk home, each step slow and thoughtful. The peaceful Sunday morning he had anticipated had turned into something he could never have expected. Yet, as he walked, a glimmer of hope grew in his chest, a hope he hadn't felt in years. Maybe change was possible, even in a small town like Willow Creek. Maybe there were more allies out there than he'd realized. As he reached his porch, Bill paused, glancing back in the direction of the diner. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, ready to reflect on the morning's events and whatever the coming days might bring. The next morning dawned bright and clear over Willow Creek, the sun casting its golden light as if nothing had changed. But for Bill Harris, everything felt different. The events of the previous day had left him shaken, filled with both the sting of pain and the warmth of unexpected hope. Rising early as was his habit, Bill went about his morning routine. Yet his thoughts continually drifted back to the confrontation at the Sunny Haven diner. He thought about Dan's hateful words, the blatant reminder of the prejudice still alive in his community. But he also thought about Mark and the bikers, their unwavering solidarity and strength. It was a reminder that both cruelty and kindness could emerge from the most unexpected places. After a simple breakfast at home, Bill decided to take a walk into town. He told himself it was just to pick up a newspaper from the kiosk near the diner, but deep down, he knew he wanted to see if anything had changed. At first, the town seemed its usual self, the quiet bustle of a new day unfolding as people hurried to work or ran errands. But as Bill approached the Sunny Haven, he noticed something unusual. A large crowd had gathered outside the diner, far more than the usual morning rush. As Bill got closer, his eyes widened in surprise. Parked in front of the diner was a long line of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming brilliantly in the morning sunlight. Standing before them, forming a silent, human barrier to the entrance, were dozens of bikers. Bill quickly counted. There were more than 50, far outnumbering the group from the previous day. They stood silently, their presence both peaceful and commanding. Many wore jackets adorned with military insignia, a quiet yet powerful testament to their service and unity. The scene was surreal. The normally quiet small-town street had transformed into the stage for a powerful statement. Passers-by stopped to take in the sight, some snapping photos on their phones while others whispered to each other. The stark contrast between the calm morning and the imposing presence of the bikers was striking. As Bill stood there, trying to process what he was seeing, a complex mix of emotions flooded him. He felt a sense of vindication, seeing such a bold response to the injustice he had endured. But he also felt a flicker of concern for what this might mean for Willow Creek, how it might affect the town, and whether there would be backlash. While he grappled with his thoughts, Bill noticed movement among the bikers. Mark, their leader, emerged from the group, his expression softening into a warm smile when he spotted Bill. "Good morning, Bill," Mark greeted him, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Bill nodded, still trying to find the right words. I didn't expect this," he finally managed. "When you said you had your own ways, I didn't imagine this." Mark chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. "We bikers know how to make a statement," he said, "and we take care of our own. What happened to you yesterday, well, that's not just your fight, it's ours too." As they spoke, Bill's attention was drawn to the diner's entrance. Dan had emerged, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. He looked around wildly, his voice sputtering with rage as he shouted, "What is this? You can't do this!" Dan's face twisted in anger as he shouted, "I'll call the police." His frustration was palpable, his desperation mounting. Mark turned to him, his demeanor calm but resolute. "Go ahead," he said evenly. "We're not breaking any laws, we're just a group of veterans visiting a local cafe." Dan's face reddened even more, his rage barely contained. He stormed back into the diner, slamming the door behind him. Through the window, Bill Harris could see Dan grabbing the phone, frantically dialing. "He's calling the police," Bill said, his voice tinged with worry. Mark nodded, unfazed. "Let him. We're not doing anything illegal, we're just making a point." Sure enough, within minutes, the sound of sirens broke the morning air. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and several officers emerged, their faces a mix of confusion and caution as they took in the scene. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples, approached Mark. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone professional but wary. Mark stepped forward, his stance respectful yet firm. "Good morning, officer," he began. "We're a group of veterans who heard about an incident of discrimination here yesterday. We're peacefully protesting and showing support for a fellow veteran." He gestured toward Bill. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Bill. "Mr. Harris," he said, nodding in greeting. "Is this true? Were you discriminated against here?" Bill stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that his words could influence the direction of what would happen next. "Yes, officer," he said clearly. "Yesterday I was refused service and told to leave, solely because of the color of my skin." A hush fell over the crowd. Even passers-by who had been unaware of the situation stopped to listen. Bill could see the range of emotions on the faces around him: shock, anger, shame, and in some cases an uncomfortable recognition of their own complicity in allowing such prejudice to persist. The officer nodded solemnly, then turned back to Mark. "And this demonstration is your response?" "Yes, sir," Mark confirmed. "We're here peacefully. We're not blocking sidewalks or preventing anyone from entering. We're just making our presence known." The officer considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "As long as you remain peaceful and don't obstruct traffic or business, you're within your rights to be here." As the officer turned to leave, Dan burst out of the cafe again, his face contorted with disbelief and fury. "You're just going to let them stay?" he demanded. "They're ruining my business." The officer fixed Dan with a stern look. "Sir, they have the right to peacefully protest. If what Mr. Plainaprank Harris says is true, I suggest you think long and hard about the real reason your business is suffering." With that, the officer returned to his patrol car, leaving Dan sputtering on the sidewalk. As the morning wore on, more and more people gathered. Some were merely curious onlookers, while others joined the protest, expressing their outrage over how Bill had been treated. Bill saw several of his neighbors arrive, offering words of support and standing in solidarity. Soon, local news vans began pulling up, their cameras and reporters eager to capture the unfolding story. Bill watched as Mark calmly explained the situation to a journalist, his words measured and compelling. The scene had transformed into something much larger than Bill could have anticipated. A statement against injustice that was rippling through the small town of Willow Creek. As Bill Harris stood on the sidelines, watching Mark recount the events of the previous day to the gathered crowd and reporters, he felt an undeniable shift in the air. Mark's words were measured but powerful, highlighting the need for change. What had started as a painful moment of personal discrimination was rapidly transforming into something much larger, a reckoning for Willow Creek. It was a moment for the community to confront its long-buried prejudices and perhaps begin to heal. Bill marveled at how quickly things had escalated. Just yesterday, he had walked into the sunny haven, hoping for a quiet breakfast. Now, he found himself at the center of a movement that seemed poised to shake the very foundation of his small town. The days that followed the protest were a whirlwind of activity in Willow Creek. A town usually so quiet and set in its ways suddenly found itself thrust into the spotlight. News vans became a fixture on Main Street as reporters swarmed to cover the story of discrimination and the community's response. For Dan, the owner of the Sunny Haven, the consequences of his actions were swift and severe. The image of dozens of bikers standing in peaceful protest outside his cafe made national headlines, bringing unwanted attention to his discriminatory behavior. Over the weeks that followed, Dan's business crumbled under the weight of the scandal and an ongoing boycott. The once bustling cafe, which had been a hub of activity, now stood eerily quiet. Through the large front windows, passers-by could see Dan slumped inside, a defeated man. The cheerful clinking of coffee cups and the warm aroma of freshly baked goods had been replaced by silence and the stale smell of a space left unused. Bill, who often passed the cafe during his daily walks, felt a mix of emotions as he looked at the desolate scene. There was a sense of justice in seeing Dan face the consequences of his actions, but there was also sadness in witnessing the downfall of a business that had once brought life to the town. Bill reminded himself that this was the result of Dan's own choices, not something anyone else had sought or desired. By the third week of the boycott, a new development began to unfold. Mark and his group of bikers, seeing an opportunity to bring about real change, approached Dan with an offer to buy the cafe. Mark invited Bill to witness the moment, and the two men found themselves standing in the nearly empty diner. The only sounds were the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional whoosh of a car passing by outside. Mark's expression was serious as he sat across from Dan at one of the cafe's tables. Sliding a document across the surface, Mark said firmly, "It's time for a change. We're offering to buy the Sunny Haven from you. Fair market value, despite the current situation." Dan's hand trembled as he reached for the paper. His eyes darted nervously between Mark and Bill, his once confident demeanor now a shadow of itself. Weeks of public scrutiny and financial strain had taken their toll, leaving deep lines on his face and a noticeable tremor in his movements. "Why?" Dan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His question hung in the air, laced with disbelief. "Why would you want this place after everything that's happened?" Dan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but kind. "Because we believe in second chances," he replied, "but we also believe in consequences. This town needs a place where everyone feels welcome, and we aim to make that happen." Bill Harris watched as Dan studied the offer, a range of emotions flickering across his face: relief, shame, resignation. After what felt like an eternity, Dan picked up the pen. His hand trembled as he signed the document, the scratch of ink on paper marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Bill felt the significance of the moment. This was more than a business transaction. A diner that had been a site of exclusion and division was being reborn as a symbol of unity and inclusion. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with news of the change in ownership. Mark and his team of bikers worked tirelessly to renovate the space, transforming it both physically and symbolically. The old sign that read "The Sunny Haven" came down, replaced with a new one that read "The Patch and Stripe Café," a name honoring both the biker and veteran communities. The grand reopening of the cafe became a community-wide event. People from all walks of life in Willow Creek turned out to see the transformation. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting, its walls adorned with photos celebrating diversity in the military, the biker community, and the town itself. Bill was given the honor of being the first customer. As he stepped inside, he was struck by the changes. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and life, a stark contrast to the tension of just a few weeks before. The chatter of patrons filled the air, and the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling breakfast wafted through the room. Bill saw young families sharing meals, elderly couples enjoying coffee, and yes, even a group of bikers. All gathered together comfortably. The diverse crowd created a vibrant energy that felt worlds away from the cafe's troubled past. Mark greeted Bill with a warm handshake, leading him to a seat at the counter, the very spot where Bill had once faced discrimination. "What do you think?" Mark asked, gesturing to the bustling cafe. Bill took a moment to take it all in. He noticed Lily, the young waitress from before, now working with a bright smile on her face, free of the tension that had once shadowed her. Behind the counter were new faces, a staff that reflected the community's diversity. "It's more than I could have imagined," Bill replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've turned something painful into something beautiful." Mark nodded, a satisfied smile crossing his face. "That's what we do, Bill," he said. "We take the ugly parts of life and rebuild them into something better." It's what we did in the service, and it's what we're doing here. As the day wore on, the cafe remained a hub of activity. The grand reopening had drawn a diverse crowd, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Bill watched the scene with a sense of wonder. Families, friends, and even groups of bikers shared the space comfortably, creating an atmosphere of unity and community. At one point, Bill noticed a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, approach a table where an elderly black couple sat. The child struck up a conversation with the couple, his innocence bridging a gap that might have otherwise seemed insurmountable. Bill smiled at the sight, a small but meaningful moment that embodied everything the new cafe stood for. For the first time in a long time, Bill felt hope. What had begun as a painful confrontation had transformed into a powerful reminder that change was possible, even in a small town like Willow Creek. At a table near the counter, an elderly black couple sat, quietly enjoying their coffee. A young boy, no more than 7 or 8, wandered over, his parents watching nervously from a few feet away. But their unease quickly turned to surprise and joy as they witnessed what happened next. The boy, with all the openness and innocence of youth, struck up a conversation with the couple. Bill Harris couldn't hear the exchange, but he saw the smiles that lit up their faces. The moment was small, almost inconspicuous, yet it represented something far larger: the breaking down of barriers, the fostering of understanding across generations and races. Mark, who had been chatting with other patrons, returned to his seat beside Bill. Noticing where Bill's gaze was fixed, he followed it to the heartwarming scene. "Now that," Mark said softly, "is what it's all about." Bill nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. The simple interaction he'd just witnessed seemed to embody everything they had been fighting for. As they sat in comfortable silence, Lily approached with a fresh pot of coffee. Bill noticed a small pin on her apron that read, "Equality serves everyone." It was a minor detail, but it spoke volumes about the profound changes that had taken place. "Refill, Mr. Harris?" Lily asked with a kind smile. Bill held out his mug, his voice brimming with gratitude that went beyond the coffee. "Thank you, Lily, and please, just call me Bill." Her smile widened. "You got it, Bill," she replied warmly before moving on to the next customer. Mark raised his mug, gesturing for Bill to do the same. "What do you say we make a toast?" Bill lifted his mug, curious. "What are we toasting to?" Mark's eyes swept across the bustling cafe before settling back on Bill. "To unexpected friendships," he began, "to standing up for what's right, to second chances, and to new beginnings," Bill added, his voice soft but firm, "and to a future where everyone feels welcome." Their mugs clinked together, the sound ringing out clearly amid the lively chatter of the cafe. It was a simple act, 2 men sharing coffee and conversation, but it symbolized something much greater: the power of community, the strength found in unity, and the change that can happen when people come together to stand against injustice. As Bill looked around the lively atmosphere of the Patch and Stripe Cafe, he felt a profound sense of hope. What had once been a place of division and pain had transformed into a beacon of inclusivity and renewal. The cafe was more than just a spot for coffee and breakfast. It had become a testament to the resilience of people willing to stand up for what was right, a powerful reminder of the positive change that can emerge from even the darkest moments. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of solidarity and transformation. If this story of standing up against injustice touched your heart as much as it did ours, we invite you to continue exploring tales of courage and community. Click here for another inspiring story you won't want to miss.